That morning, they claimed an app could do the job I kept alive for 16 years. By the weekend, the port watched 47 ships sitting dead at anchor like a giant floating confession. The man who fired me thought he cut a redundant roll, never understanding he severed the system's memory. "Please help," he begged when he called at 2:13 in the morning. It was too late for apologies, but perfectly on time to pay the price. My name is Brooklyn Rivera. I am 42 years old, and until this exact miserable morning, I was the vessel flow dispatch director of Morrow Point Terminal. Located in the fictional, constantly gray-skied port city of Brackett Sound, Georgia, this terminal was my entire life. I stepped into the morning shift exactly the way I had for the past 16 years. I walked through the heavy, salt-choked fog that always clung to the riverbanks before dawn. The air tasted of diesel exhaust, cold brine, and impending rain. The low, guttural blast of a tugboat horn echoed from the narrow shipping channel, a sound I felt rattling deep inside my ribs before I even consciously registered hearing it. The terminal was a beast that never slept, and I was the one holding its leash. My office was a glass box perched high above the chaos, overlooking a sprawling concrete container yard that hummed with the mechanical growls of transport trucks and the rhythmic, deafening clanking of steel locking mechanisms. I dropped my canvas bag on the scuffed linoleum floor and immediately woke up my 3 monitors. They flared to life, casting a cold, clinical blue glow over my cluttered desk. Those screens were the nerve center of the entire operation. Screen 1 tracked inbound vessel estimated times of arrival, a constantly shifting puzzle of massive steel giants fighting ocean currents. Screen 2 mapped out the unforgiving, razor-thin tidal windows and the tight berth schedules that dictated whether a ship docked safely or ran aground. Screen 3 was the critical one for this specific morning, a scrolling, color-coded list of refrigerated cargo, which we called reefers, that absolutely had to be plugged into the terminal grid and prioritized before 12 noon. If they sat unchecked, millions of dollars of imported produce and pharmaceuticals would rot in their steel boxes. The wind was already picking up outside, violently rattling the heavy glass panes of my office, warning me of a difficult, high-stakes shift ahead. I was just reaching for my radio to call the yardmaster and warn him about a delayed arrival when the heavy office door swung open without a knock. It was not a casual entrance, it was an orchestrated invasion. Cade Whitmore walked in. He was 31 years old, dressed in a sharply tailored, expensive suit that had clearly never brushed against a rusted shipping container or smelled of the muddy riverbank. Cade was the newly appointed Chief Flow Transformation Officer, a ridiculous title that had never existed at Morrow Point before he showed up. He did not come alone. A woman from Human Resources trailed closely behind him, clutching a thick manila envelope against her chest like a protective shield. Beside her stood a pale, nervous young man from the Information Technology Department, his eyes darting everywhere except at my face. Cade did not offer a polite greeting. He did not sit down in the chair opposite my desk. He did not ask how the brutal night shift had gone, nor did he inquire about the incoming stormfront building out over the Atlantic. He just stood there, hands casually tucked into his pockets, exuding the unearned confidence of a man who firmly believed software code could tame the ocean tides. "We are shifting to a modern logistics model." "Brooklyn," Cade announced. His voice was flat, practiced, and completely devoid of empathy or hesitation. "The board has decided that relying on human intuition is a liability. Your entire workflow is essentially just slotting by outdated experience. It is simply not scalable for our future operations." I kept my hands perfectly flat on the desk, refusing to show the sudden spike of adrenaline in my blood. "You cannot scale a river, Cade. The tide does not care about your metrics." He offered a tight, patronizing smile. "That is exactly the mindset we are moving away from. We have acquired a platform called Stack Fleet Pulse. It is an automated system that optimizes scheduling based on real-time data flow. It will do what you do, but faster, cheaper, and without the bottlenecks of manual oversight." I looked at the Human Resources representative, who swallowed hard, gripped the envelope tighter, and looked firmly at her shoes. I looked back at Cade. Stackfleet is a warehouse management tool. It routes trucks in enclosed, controlled environments. It does not know how to handle a 90,000-ton vessel fighting a crosswind in a narrow channel. Cade's smile vanished. His eyes hardened into something ugly and intensely defensive. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of my desk, trying to assert dominance over my space. "You need to understand your actual place here," he sneered. "You are not a port operator. You are just an over-promoted warehouse foreman who got lucky for a few years. We do not need a foreman anymore. We need an algorithm." The insult hung in the cramped office air, heavy and suffocating. It was designed to provoke me, to make me yell, to make me a hysterical woman being escorted out by security guards. It made everything freeze. The heat drained completely from my chest, replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. I had spent 16 years of my life bleeding for this concrete and steel monstrosity. I had skipped holidays, ruined relationships, and barely slept, all to keep the supply chain moving smoothly. Now, an arrogant 31-year-old was standing there, erasing my entire existence with a single phrase. The human resources representative stepped forward, placing the termination envelope on the exact center of my desk. The soft, dull thud of the paper felt louder than the massive cranes groaning outside. At the exact same second, the pale information technology kid stepped toward my workstation. He was literally waiting for me to stand up so he could sever my network access, locking me out of the system I had painstakingly built and maintained from the ground up. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I did not cry. I did not argue. Arguments were for naive people who still believed they could change a pre-written outcome. I simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. I reached into my top drawer, carefully bypassing the cheap company pens and branded stationery. I pulled out my dark red pocket notebook. Its crinkled pages were filled with handwritten tide charts, specific pilot preferences, unwritten union rules, and direct phone numbers that existed nowhere on the official company servers. I grabbed a small, battered USB drive containing the emergency contingency templates I had personally written over a decade ago. Finally, I reached down and unclipped my personal two-way radio from my heavy leather belt. It was mine, bought with my own money, programmed to local maritime frequencies Cade did not even know existed. I set my worn plastic company ID badge neatly on top of the manila envelope. I stood up. The IT kid immediately lunged for my keyboard, his fingers flying across the keys in a frantic blur to execute the lockout protocol. The blue screens flickered, stuttered, and died, instantly replaced by a generic corporate login screen. They had officially severed my connection to the terminal. I turned and walked out of the office. I moved down the narrow metal staircase, the sound of my heavy work boots ringing sharply against the steel grating. The descent felt impossibly long, yet somehow terribly short. On my way out to the desolate parking lot, I paused for a single moment in the enclosed, elevated walkway that bridged the main terminal building to the outside world. I looked through the thick, salt-stained glass. Out on the slate-gray water, battling the choppy waves of the river mouth, I saw two massive feeder vessels fighting the vicious current. Their bows were angled sharply, engines roaring as they battled a sudden, powerful crosswind. I knew instantly, just by looking at their aggressive angle and the plume of black smoke erupting from their stacks, that they were significantly changing their estimated times of arrival. One vessel was heavily loaded with critical, temperature-sensitive perishable goods. The other was carrying bulky, heavy machinery that required a specific crane configuration to unload safely. In my head, my mind immediately raced, and I had already resequenced the yard cranes and adjusted the rail slots to accommodate the delay without disrupting the rest of the morning schedule. But as I watched them struggle, a cold, hard realization settled over me. I knew with absolute certainty that the new app, Stackfleet Pulse, would fail spectacularly. The software would look at the unavoidable delay, register a missed time slot, and ruthlessly throw those two ships to the absolute back of the queue. The algorithm would ignore the critical cargo entirely, treating 90,000 tons of floating steel like a late delivery van at a suburban warehouse. I pushed the heavy steel exit door open and walked out into the freezing morning chill. The wind whipped my hair across my face, biting at my cheeks. I left the towering administration building in total, ringing silence. I did not look back at the glass box that had been my entire life for over a decade. But right at the very second the heavy, reinforced security door clicked shut and locked permanently behind me, the brutal truth of the moment settled heavily over the concrete yard. The men upstairs honestly believed they had excised a redundant, outdated piece of the corporate machine. They were entirely too blind and arrogant to realize they had just ripped out the only beating heart keeping the entire port alive. Long before the corporate consultants arrived with their polished presentations and sterile metrics, I spent 12 years in the United States Coast Guard Vessel Traffic Service. In the military, you do not manage a commercial waterway with polite suggestions or automated algorithms. You manage it with absolute, unforgiving precision. I learned to track massive steel hulls navigating through blinding fog banks, calculating safe separation distances when visibility dropped to absolute zero. I learned the heavy, undeniable truth that 90,000 tons of steel moving at 14 knots cannot simply hit the brakes because someone made a scheduling error. I learned that water is a living, breathing, hostile entity that does not care about your deadlines or your profit margins. It respects only physics, gravity, and the pull of the moon. When I eventually left the service, Morrow Point Terminal recruited me aggressively. They did not hire me because I had a shiny business degree or a talent for corporate networking. They hired me because their terminal sat on one of the most treacherous, unpredictable river channels on the entire eastern seaboard. The Brackett Sound River approach was not a straight, easy glide from the open ocean. It was a winding, treacherous snake of dark water, flanked by shallow mudflats and jagged rock breakwaters that eagerly awaited a single miscalculated rudder command. The tide there shifted with violent, sudden speed, creating notoriously narrow, unforgiving windows for heavy draft vessels to enter or exit safely. On top of the brutal ocean currents, the approach was bottlenecked by an ancient, temperamental lift bridge, a hopelessly congested inland rail yard situated directly behind the docks, and a highly sensitive refrigerated cargo zone that demanded constant, uninterrupted power. It was a logistical minefield, a daily disaster waiting to happen, and the board of directors needed someone who could see the explosions before the sparks even caught. Over the course of 16 years, I did not just schedule ships. Anyone with a ruler and a clock can draw lines on a chart. What I built from the ground up was a living, breathing neural network. It was an intricate, invisible web of trust, sweat, and shared misery that connected every single moving part of the waterfront. My network included the grizzled river pilots who knew every hidden sandbar by memory, the tugboat crews who guided the behemoths into their berths while smelling of diesel and stale coffee, the union shift bosses who controlled the fragile labor flow, the crane engineers suspended 100 feet in the air, the rail dispatchers working miles inland, and the overseas shipping coordinators operating out of Europe, South America, and the Gulf Coast. None of this vital information lived in a company database. My brain was a constantly updating ledger of human variables. I knew these people intimately, and I knew their specific, unrecorded habits. I knew that the chief dispatcher in Rotterdam absolutely hated last-minute schedule changes and would purposely bury your cargo at the bottom of a stack if you surprised him. I knew exactly which local harbor pilot habitually reported his estimated time of arrival 45 minutes later than his actual time, just to give himself a comfortable buffer against the notoriously slow dock workers. I knew which tugboat captain would only execute a dangerous docking maneuver in heavy winds if he heard a calm, familiar voice on the radio, confirming that the cross-channel traffic was entirely clear. My system was not a software program you could purchase and install. It was a vast, complex architecture built entirely out of memory, ingrained habits, and a hard-earned reputation on the docks. It required reading the subtle shift in the color of the morning sky, understanding the exact velocity of the water rushing past the wooden pilings, feeling the sudden drop in barometric pressure in my joints, and knowing the volatile, unpredictable temperaments of the hundreds of men and women working the concrete yard below. Because of that unseen network, I saved Morrow Point from countless operational disasters, and I did it so smoothly that nobody in the executive boardroom ever knew the terminal was in actual danger. I knew exactly when to quietly shift a massive vessel carrying millions of dollars of temperature-sensitive fruit to an alternate berth, preventing a catastrophic loss of the cold chain. I knew how to manually reorder the discharge sequence of the massive ship-to-shore cranes, so the incoming heavy containers would not completely jam the fragile rail yard bottleneck. I once forced a furious ship captain to answer his radio at 2 a.m, demanding he push his engines to the absolute limit to beat a freak thunderstorm that would have trapped his vessel outside the breakwater for 3 entire days. I solved severe crises before they ever materialized, which ultimately meant there was never a paper trail of my victories to justify my existence to the accountants. But that level of hypervigilance required a brutal, unrelenting toll on my personal life. The port slowly but surely devoured everything else, demanding my constant attention like a starving animal. My existence outside the terminal eroded into a depressing series of missed milestones, silent apologies, and exhausted weekends. When my younger sister Marisol finally cut the red ribbon to open her dream restaurant downtown, I was not standing there holding a glass of champagne to celebrate. I was trapped in the dispatch center, desperately rerouting a delayed shipment of hazardous chemicals that threatened to shut down the entire southern sector of the port. I saw the vibrant, happy photos the next day on my phone, sitting alone in my office, smelling only the sharp tang of ozone and diesel fumes. I canceled vacation after vacation with my partner, Elias Mercer. Elias was a high school history teacher, a man possessing a deep, quiet patience that stood in stark contrast to the screaming metal and chaotic energy of the docks. We would meticulously plan a week away in the mountains, only to have a massive labor dispute or a sudden channel dredging issue obliterate the schedule at the very last second. We grew intimately accustomed to eating dinner in our small kitchen, the food growing cold on our plates while I sat illuminated by the harsh glare of a laptop screen, obsessively checking tidal telemetry and whispering frantic orders into my phone. Elias never yelled. He never threw ultimatums or demanded I quit. But one rainy Tuesday evening, after I had ruined yet another anniversary dinner because a bulk carrier had lost steering in the main channel, he looked at me across the kitchen island. His voice was soft, carrying a heavy, sorrowful weight that broke my heart. "You are not just making that port run, Brooklyn," Elias said, his eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of profound love and deep pity. "You are letting it borrow your entire life, and it is never going to give it back." That single sentence haunted me. It echoed in my mind during the long, solitary drives to the terminal before sunrise. It whispered through the radio static during the chaotic, freezing night shifts. I gave Morrow Point my youth, my peace of mind, and my precious family time, mistakenly believing that such profound, unwavering sacrifice was the ultimate currency of loyalty in the maritime industry. That was the true, agonizing pain of the termination. It was not the sudden loss of a comfortable paycheck or the stripping of a prestigious director title. It was the devastating realization of how my immense sacrifice had been casually translated by the new corporate regime. The board of directors did not look at my deep, instinctual connection to the waterfront and see a master conductor keeping a chaotic, dangerous symphony in perfect rhythm. They looked at my handwritten notebooks, my personal radio calls, and my nuanced understanding of human nature, and they saw a stubborn, outdated liability. They viewed 16 years of flawless, life-consuming dedication as a mere operational bottleneck. They genuinely believed that the intricate, messy, beautiful human element of maritime logistics was a fatal flaw waiting to be beautifully eradicated by clean lines of code. They thought my fierce loyalty was simply an embarrassing inability to adapt to modern technology. The absolute disrespect of being replaced by a sterile, unthinking application cut deeper than any physical wound. I had bled for the concrete yard and the deep water, giving them every ounce of my energy, and in return, they treated my entire existence like a corrupted file they could simply highlight and casually delete. Let us talk about the title first. Chief Flow Transformation Officer. It was a completely fabricated arrangement of syllables meticulously engineered to sound incredibly expensive and undeniably important. Before Cade Whitmore arrived, Morrow Point operated under standard, centuries-old maritime hierarchy. We had directors, captains, masters, and foremen. But Cade needed a throne, so the executive board happily built him one out of thin air. It helped tremendously, of course, that his uncle was Russ Whitmore, the chairman of the Port Authority Board. Nepotism is a funny, toxic thing. It never wears a prominent name tag, but it always manages to get the absolute best parking spot in the executive lot. Prior to becoming the supposed savior of our gritty waterfront, Cade's entire logistics resume consisted of exactly 8 months at a slick tech startup called Parcelmetric Labs. Their core business model was optimizing retail fulfillment centers. Cade was entirely used to perfectly climate-controlled, entirely predictable boxes where automated conveyor belts moved identical cardboard squares at a constant, mathematical speed. He had never tasted the harsh mixture of sulfur, diesel, and salt that choked the air of a night shift out on the concrete yard. He had never stood shoulder to shoulder in a cramped, violently swaying pilot house while a sudden 50-foot swell threatened to capsize a fully loaded vessel. He had absolutely zero concept of the terrifying reality of what it meant when a ship commander radioed in a blind panic because a sudden cargo shift had altered the massive vessel's draft by 3 feet at the very last minute, instantly turning a previously safe river entry into a guaranteed catastrophic grounding. I was practically forced to sit through his grand introductory presentation to the executive board. It was a masterclass in aggressive, corporate emptiness. He confidently clicked through 51 perfectly formatted presentation slides. I counted every single one of them to keep myself from screaming out loud. He paced the thick, imported carpet of the boardroom, a sterile, hushed place completely insulated from the deafening roar of the actual port just 2 floors below us. He peppered the suffocating, air-conditioned air with sterile corporate jargon, repeating the exact same hollow phrases over and over until they lost all meaning. "We need complete, end-to-end visibility," he declared, adjusting his expensive, customized cuffs. "We must ensure massive scalability across all operational vectors. The future of this port is touchless scheduling. We have to aggressively eliminate these outdated legacy bottlenecks." I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table and stared at him, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I realized with absolute horror that he considered the blood, sweat, and split-second survival instincts of my dockworkers to be nothing more than a legacy bottleneck. His grand, infallible solution to these imaginary manufactured problems was a unilateral, incredibly expensive contract for Stackfleet Pulse. It was a software platform explicitly designed and marketed for inland warehouse networks and highway truck distribution logistics. It was built from the ground up to manage enclosed, concrete loading bays where standard 18-wheelers backed up on perfectly flat, completely dry asphalt under bright fluorescent lights. It was emphatically not built for a turbulent tidal river port, dealing with deep-water ocean vessels, massive shore cranes, explosive hazardous materials, and an inherently chaotic, interlocked rail interchange. The software was profoundly, dangerously stupid. Regarding the unforgiving realities of maritime physics, it literally could not comprehend the concept of a real tidal window. It viewed the shipping channel as a static, unmoving highway, completely ignoring the fact that it was a dynamic, powerful body of water that rapidly rose and fell by 9 feet every 6 hours. It could not read, understand, or anticipate the complex, deeply unofficial rules forged by the labor unions over decades of bitter strikes and hard-won negotiations. It completely failed to calculate the mandatory, unpredictable delay times caused by the federal agriculture inspectors arbitrarily putting a sudden hold on a load of cold quarantine cargo. Worst of all, Stackfleet Pulse viewed our massive, deeply specialized docking berths as nothing more than simple, interchangeable dock slots. It blindly assumed you could park a heavy, deep-draft, crude oil tanker in the exact same spot you would put a tiny domestic barge, completely disregarding the underwater topography. The specific crane reach, or the reinforced mooring bollards required for different vessels. I tried to stop the impending disaster. I am not a person who goes down quietly or allows a ship to sink without firing a warning flare. I typed out 3 separate, painstakingly detailed emails to Cade. I mapped out, using historical data and hard operational facts, exactly how the port data was being forcibly digitized under completely flawed, fundamentally dangerous logic. I explicitly explained that translating our fluid, elemental, weather-dependent operations into rigid, unyielding warehouse algorithms would instantly trigger a catastrophic chain reaction across the entire supply chain. Cade called me into his pristine, minimalist office the morning after I sent the 3rd email. He did not extend the basic courtesy of asking me to sit down. He simply looked up from his glowing tablet, projecting the deeply condescending, weary patience of a brilliant teacher forced to deal with a particularly slow, stubborn child. "Brooklyn," he sighed heavily, clasping his perfectly manicured hands together on his spotless desk. "Every single industry thinks it is incredibly special and utterly unique right up until the exact moment software finally fixes it. You are stubbornly resisting the inevitable march of progress. You need to get on board with the new vision, or the ship is going to sail without you." He actually used a cheap, cliché maritime pun to formally dismiss 16 years of my operational expertise. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of that moment made my jaw ache from clenching my teeth. He was so incredibly confident in his engineered triumph that he actually took to a major professional networking website the very next day to brag to the corporate world. He posted a lengthy, self-congratulatory essay boasting about how he was personally, single-handedly leading the biggest digital restructuring on the entire southeast coast. He attached a highly polished, professionally lit photograph of himself staring thoughtfully out a pristine glass window, naturally standing nowhere near the actual dirty, oily water of the docks. The post rapidly garnered hundreds of likes and fawning, sycophantic comments from other sheltered tech executives who had never lifted anything heavier than a digital stylus in their entire privileged lives. People in the regional supply chain industry started paying close attention, marveling at the bold, disruptive new direction Morrow Point was supposedly taking under his visionary leadership. They did not realize what they were actually applauding. The true devastating ticking time bomb buried beneath the concrete of the terminal was not the Stackfleet app itself. Software is ultimately just lines of code. It can be quickly deleted, frantically rewritten, or simply unplugged from the wall when it inevitably fails. The real catastrophic explosive device was the blind, unbreakable belief held by Cade and the complacent executive board. They genuinely believed that a volatile, breathing ecosystem, one wholly reliant on human intuition, elemental survival against nature, and deep, living relationships, could simply be forced against its will to run on the sterile, unyielding mathematics of a closed-wall warehouse. They had confidently armed the detonator with their own breathtaking ignorance, and now, all anyone out on the water could do was brace themselves and wait for the clock to violently hit 0. I did not drive back to my house after the security gates locked behind me. The steering wheel felt incredibly strange in my hands, as if my physical body had entirely forgotten how to exist in a space that was not vibrating with the low, constant frequency of industrial diesel engines. I steered my heavy truck toward the southern breakwater, a desolate, windswept stretch of jagged granite boulders that jutted out into the turbulent Atlantic Ocean like a crooked, accusing finger. I parked on the uneven gravel shoulder, rolled the windows down, and let the freezing saltwater spray coat my face. I reached into my bag and turned on my portable marine radio. The familiar, comforting static hissed through the cabin, punctuated by the terse, clipped voices of harbor pilots and tugboat captains navigating the morning swells. Sitting there alone, staring across the vast, gray expanse of water at the towering steel cranes of Morrow Point, I felt a bizarre, hollow sensation. I was a ghost looking at the house I had painstakingly built, locked out in the bitter cold while arrogant strangers wandered blindly through the vital rooms. I sat on those rocks for hours, and then I drove back to the exact same spot the next day. Over the course of 36 hours, I sat in my truck and watched the new software begin to quietly, inevitably unravel the intricate tapestry I had woven. From my elevated vantage point on the breakwater, the catastrophic logic of the application was laid bare on the horizon. I watched 3 massive inbound vessels get ordered into holding patterns that defied all maritime sanity. They were stacked in the outer anchorage in a sequence that completely ignored their heavy draft depth, placing ships requiring deep water into shallow holding zones that risked a catastrophic grounding. Worse, I saw a pristine, white-hulled, refrigerated ship forced to drop its heavy iron anchor directly behind a rusting, battered dry bulk carrier. The dry bulk vessel was filled with low-grade agricultural grain, a commodity that could sit in the humid ocean air for weeks without degrading a single percent. The refrigerated ship, however, was burning thousands of gallons of expensive fuel just to keep its internal generators running, desperately trying to stop a cargo hold full of imported temperature-critical goods from spoiling. The algorithm was treating them as identical, equal units, entirely blind to the ticking biological clock of the sensitive cargo. Then, the most agonizing blow came just as the sky turned a bruised, deep purple. A perfect glassy sunset transit window opened up, a rare, highly coveted moment when the incoming tide and the dying wind synchronized perfectly to allow a massive ship a smooth, unimpeded glide into the narrow river channel. The window stayed open for exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes. Nothing moved. The dark water remained totally empty. The software had simply failed to recognize the subtle environmental opportunity, wasting a golden slot that could have cleared millions of dollars of backlog. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white, physically aching from the sheer, arrogant stupidity of it all. That evening, the heavy, suffocating silence of my living room was shattered by the sudden ringing of my cell phone. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar out-of-state number. I answered the call, fully expecting a confused, angry dispatcher from Europe who had not yet heard the news of my sudden termination. Instead, a sharp, deeply authoritative woman's voice cut through the line. "Brooklyn Rivera," the voice said. It was a statement of fact, not a question. "My name is Naomi Vance. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Granite Shoals Marine over in Arden Cape, South Carolina." I froze. The phone pressed tightly against my ear. Granite Shoals Marine was our fiercest regional competitor, a rapidly expanding, highly aggressive port facility situated just 200 miles further up the coastline. "I am not calling to offer you empty corporate condolences," Naomi continued, her tone brisk and entirely devoid of standard professional fluff. "I have been closely monitoring the operational flow at Morrow Point for the past 5 years. I know exactly what their executive board of directors thinks is happening over there, and I know the actual, undeniable truth of what makes that terminal function. It is not their brilliant strategic vision. It is you. And since they have just made the most spectacularly foolish decision in the history of the Eastern Seaboard, I am stepping in to capitalize on their stupidity." Naomi Vance did not simply offer me a job. She offered me an entire empire. She laid out a comprehensive proposal for a completely new role, Chief Operations Architect. The annual salary she quoted was nearly double what I had been making, but the massive amount of money was the least interesting part of the conversation. "I do not want you to just come down here and plug the holes in a sinking ship," Naomi insisted, her voice vibrating with intense ambition. "I want you to rip our entire operational infrastructure down to the bare concrete and rebuild it from scratch. You will have absolute, unchecked authority to restructure the vessel flow, hire your own dedicated personnel, and standardize the procedures across the board. Most importantly, I want you to build a resilient, fail-proof succession system. I want you to create a human network so incredibly strong that the port will not instantly collapse if you happen to catch the flu. We are going to build a machine that relies on shared competence and deep training, not the endless sacrifice and individual martyrdom of one person. The offer was staggering. A massive, brilliantly lit door swinging wide open just as I had been violently shoved out of a dark window. Yet, as I sat at my small kitchen table after ending the call, a heavy knot of hesitation anchored itself deep in my chest. I did not love the corporate entity of my former employer. I felt absolutely zero loyalty to the arrogant men sitting in the air-conditioned boardroom, but the waterfront is a sacred brotherhood forged in salt, exhaustion, and daily danger. I thought about the exhausted crane operators, the gruff foremen, the skilled pilots, and the frantic dispatchers who were currently walking blindly into a technological meat grinder. Walking away to a rival facility felt uncomfortably like abandoning my loyal crew on a rapidly sinking vessel. I explained this agonizing internal conflict to Elias as he quietly poured 2 cups of hot steaming tea. He sat across from me, his calm, steady eyes analyzing the deep lines of stress etched into my face. He listened in complete silence until I finally ran out of words and let out a long, defeated sigh. He reached across the wooden table and gently covered my shaking hands with his own warm palms. "Brooklyn," Elias said softly, his voice carrying a quiet, undeniable strength. "You do not owe anyone the moral duty of staying behind to haunt a place that just buried you alive. They dug the grave themselves. Let them lie in it." His words struck a deep, resonant chord. But the final, decisive blow to my hesitation came the following morning. My father, Rafael Rivera, stopped by the house for breakfast. He was a retired tugboat captain, a tough, unyielding man whose hands were permanently calloused by decades of hauling heavy hemp ropes and steering massive, stubborn vessels through treacherous, unforgiving currents. He poured his black coffee, listened to the entire story of the brutal termination and the unexpected new offer, and then fixed me with a fierce stare that could cut through the thickest marine fog. "You are looking at this entirely backward, kid," my father growled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the kitchen. "You did not abandon the port. You never walked away from the water. They actively, purposefully abandoned the person who knew exactly how to keep the entire operation afloat. They made their choice, and now they have to drown in it." The heavy, crushing guilt instantly evaporated from my shoulders, replaced by a cold, burning clarity that felt incredibly powerful. He was absolutely right. Accepting Naomi Vance's offer was not an act of cowardly retreat. It was the first, deliberate step of the most devastating, perfectly clean retaliation imaginable. I was not going to hack into their system to sabotage their newly installed software. I was not going to leak their embarrassing internal documents to the press or throw a public tantrum. I was simply going to take my intense dedication, my deep institutional knowledge, and my fierce, hard-earned competence, and I was going to hand it all over to a facility that actually respected the profound value of a human mind. I picked up my phone, dialed the South Carolina area code, and told Naomi Vance I was ready to build her a fortress. My first week at Granite Shoals Marine did not feature a flashy press release. I did not waste my time drafting aggressive marketing emails, and I absolutely forbade my new staff from launching any kind of public campaign to steal business from my former employer. In this industry, trust is not manufactured by a public relations department. It is forged over years of shared stress, late-night phone calls, and promises kept when millions of dollars are on the line. I simply walked into my new, spacious office, closed the heavy door, sat down at my desk, and started dialing the personal phone numbers of the dispatchers, vessel coordinators, and freight brokers I had worked with for over a decade. My pitch was incredibly short. Every single call felt as heavy and binding as an unsigned contract. I did not offer them aggressively slashed rates. I did not promise them impossible turnaround speeds. I simply told them the exact truth they desperately needed to hear. I called a senior dispatcher based in Valencia, Spain, a man who managed a massive fleet of deep-water cargo ships. "This is Brooklyn Rivera," I said when he picked up the receiver. "I am no longer at Morrow Point. I am currently running operations at Granite Shoals. If you send your ships to my new terminal, You will have someone who actually answers the phone on the first ring. You will have a director who understands the tidal charts, who knows exactly how to balance your rail interchange, and who knows how to handle your refrigerated units without forcing you to explain your entire logistical operation from scratch. The line went completely silent for a moment. 20 minutes later, his direct assistant called my office back and instantly rerouted a massive container vessel that was currently halfway across the Atlantic Ocean. The dominoes began to fall with brutal, satisfying speed. A massive shipping conglomerate headquartered in Santos, Brazil, agreed to divert a trial voyage to our docks just to see if my promises held true. Less than 48 hours after that, a major cold chain transport unit operating out of Halifax made a decisive, sweeping move. They transferred their entire upcoming peak season schedule away from my old port and handed it directly to Granite Shoals. They did not do it because our cranes were newer or our concrete was smoother. They did it because they knew my voice, and they trusted my word over any automated corporate guarantee. While the international freight began to quietly shift toward my new home, I initiated a radical internal transformation at Granite Shoals. I was given absolute authority, and my first major decision was a direct reaction to the fatal flaw of my previous career. I refused to be the sole load-bearing pillar of the operation anymore. I handpicked a dedicated team of 6 incredibly sharp, ambitious operations managers. I gathered them in a conference room and explicitly told them we were building a living playbook. Instead of hoarding every critical detail, unwritten rule, and complex contingency plan inside my own head, I dragged all of my institutional knowledge out into the open. I forced my team of 6 to aggressively cross-train across every single department. We did not just sit and look at spreadsheets. I ran them through brutal, high-pressure simulation drills. I forced them to navigate artificial scenarios where a major hurricane wiped out the night shift schedule. We practiced what to do when a primary gantry crane suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure during a heavy discharge. We mapped out the exact protocols for a sudden channel closure or a massive blockage on the inland rail network. This process created a profound, structural difference between my new home and the place that had fired me. I had finally learned the most expensive, agonizing lesson of my professional life. A truly exceptional operational system must be designed to survive and thrive even when it's smartest. Most experienced person is completely absent. I was building a resilient, adaptable human network that could not be easily severed by a single termination letter. Meanwhile, just 200 miles down the coast, the brittle, arrogant illusion Cade Whitmore had built at Morrow Point began to violently shatter. The cracks in Stackfleet Pulse exposed themselves almost immediately, proving exactly how dangerous it is to force the chaotic reality of the ocean into the rigid logic of a warehouse application. The very first disaster struck when the automated system blindly issued the exact same berth assignment to 2 entirely different vessels. The software simply looked at the physical dimensions of the dock and the length of the ships, completely ignoring the crucial, ever-changing reality of the water beneath them. It scheduled a heavy-draft crude carrier and a standard container ship to approach the dock during a tidal window that only possessed enough deep water to safely support one of them. The river pilots had to execute a terrifying emergency abort maneuver out in the channel, screaming over the radio frequencies as they narrowly avoided grounding a massive hull on the hidden sandbars. The software then proceeded to trigger a catastrophic failure within the sensitive refrigerated cargo sector. Stackfleet Pulse operated on a basic algorithm designed to prioritize inventory with the highest warehouse turnover rate. Out on the concrete yard, it automatically bumped a massive shipment of cheap, flat-pack furniture to the absolute front of the discharge queue. While the cranes spent hours unloading wooden tables and chairs, a secondary vessel loaded with critical temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals and highly perishable imported fruit was left anchored out in the blazing sun. The application entirely failed to comprehend that a delay in the furniture meant a slightly annoyed retail manager, while a delay in the refrigerated units meant breaking the strict cold chain, instantly destroying millions of dollars of life-saving medical supplies and food. However, the final, most explosive failure of the software happened when it attempted to dictate the human labor force. The local dockworkers union quickly discovered that the new application was automatically generating their shift schedules using strict, individual warehouse logic. For decades, the waterfront had operated on deeply entrenched, informally negotiated gang divisions. Men and women worked in specific, specialized teams that relied on unspoken communication, extreme mutual trust, and a shared rhythm to move heavy steel safely. Stack Fleet Pulse ruthlessly tore those experienced teams apart. It treated the highly skilled, specialized dock workers as simple, interchangeable data points, randomly assigning a heavy machinery driver to a manual lashing crew and putting a seasoned rail coordinator on a basic ground guide detail. It destroyed the fragile, hard-won harmony of the yard. The atmosphere on the docks rapidly shifted from general annoyance to bitter, open rebellion. The workers stopped communicating with the management office. They slowed their movements down to the exact, painstaking letter of their contracts, a deliberate, perfectly legal maneuver that instantly crippled the overall speed of the terminal. It was a deeply bitter, poetic paradox that became glaringly obvious to anyone paying attention to the eastern seaboard. The arrogant executives at my former port had foolishly replaced a deeply experienced human being with a sterile piece of software, fundamentally believing technology could erase the need for human intuition. At the exact same time, I was utilizing the advanced technology and resources at Granite Shoals to fiercely empower, educate, and strengthen my human team, ensuring they could never be easily replaced or erased. The massive, invisible gears of the global supply chain were beginning to violently turn, driven entirely by the undeniable power of trust, and my old port was standing directly in the path of the crushing weight. The collapse did not happen all at once. A massive, interconnected logistical ecosystem does not simply switch off like a light bulb. It dies in a sequence of cascading, brutal failures, building pressure until the entire structure violently ruptures. The Hell Week began, and I watched it unfold from a comfortable distance, tracking the disaster through satellite feeds and panicked whispers across the industry. Day one began with a mathematical impossibility that a human being would have caught in 3 seconds. The Stack Fleet Pulse application issued an identical clearance window for the main river channel to 2 distinct inbound vessels. The software merely saw an open time slot and filled it twice, completely blind to the physical reality that 2 massive steel hulls cannot occupy the same narrow stretch of dredged water. One vessel was a heavy bulk carrier riding incredibly low. The other was a highly critical refrigerated ship. Out on the choppy water, the senior harbor pilot stared at his digital manifest, realized the catastrophic overlap, and immediately keyed his radio to force an emergency abort. He had to choose the heavy freighter because stopping its forward momentum in that current was physically impossible. The refrigerated ship was forced to swerve hard, missing the safe tidal marker by mere minutes. It had no choice but to drop its heavy iron anchors in the outer harbor and wait. The fatal bottleneck had officially started. The digital ignorance compounded exponentially on day 2. Down on the concrete dock, massive ship to shore, crane number 6 was completely out of commission. It was undergoing mandatory hydraulic cylinder maintenance, rendering it a massive piece of dead metal surrounded by yellow scaffolding. The algorithm, however, only registered the berth space beneath it as active and empty. It aggressively routed 3 consecutive container ships to that exact dead zone, flooding the immediate yard with thousands of steel boxes. Because the broken crane could not move the incoming cargo to the transfer zones, the stacked containers formed an impenetrable steel wall. The logistical chokehold instantly bled out of the terminal and into the city streets. A miles-long convoy of diesel transport trucks idled outside the security gates, their frustrated drivers blasting their horns into the smoggy air, completely trapped in a standstill that the computer insisted did not exist. By day 3, the paralysis reached deep into the inland rail interchange. The terminal rail yard requires a delicate, deeply synchronized rhythm. You have to load the heavy containers onto the train cars exactly when the interregional locomotives arrive. Stack Fleet Pulse operated on a frantic, warehouse-style release schedule, dumping cargo onto the asphalt without ever checking the actual railroad timetables. Hundreds of containers slammed into the staging ground with absolutely no available rail slots to receive them. The human rail coordinators watched in absolute horror as the steel boxes piled up in the wrong transit zones, physically blocking the tracks themselves. The trains could not enter, the cargo could not leave, and the terminal's internal arteries suffered a massive, undeniable stroke. Day 4 triggered the high-level financial alarms. The software was strictly programmed to maximize a single metric it called the turnaround score. It favored ships that could be unloaded and kicked out quickly, regardless of what they were actually carrying. Consequently, the application continually shoved a highly prioritized refrigerated ship to the back of the line, opting instead to process 3 simple, easily unloaded dry bulk carriers. The dry bulk held nothing but gravel and scrap metal, while the refrigerated vessel held millions of dollars of organic material and medical supplies. Deep inside the holds of the stranded ship, the cold chain began to fracture. Warning lights flashed wildly on the bridge as fuel ran dangerously low for the auxiliary cooling generators. Before the sun even set, the first furious warnings from the maritime insurance conglomerates hit the corporate inboxes at Morro Point, threatening massive liability lawsuits for the impending rot. On day 5, the human element finally weaponized itself. The longshoremen and union operators did not officially declare a strike, which would have violated their strict federal contracts. Instead, they executed a devastating work-to-rule campaign. They followed every single safety regulation, every obscure maintenance check, and every mandated rest period to the absolute, painstaking letter of the law. A standard container transfer that usually took 2 minutes suddenly took 10. A chassis inspection took 15. The yard slowed to an agonizing, deliberate crawl. Out on the ocean, the designated holding zones were completely overflowing. Desperate ship captains flooded the emergency radio frequencies, their voices raw with frustration, demanding a clear berthing order from a dispatch tower that was entirely paralyzed by its own software. The open airwaves descended into total, screaming chaos. Day 6 was the day the disaster escalated into a humiliating public spectacle. The local television news stations realized something was horribly wrong when the horizon turned into a solid wall of steel. They sent camera helicopters out over the choppy water. The live broadcast beamed directly into living rooms across the entire city, showing rows upon rows of massive container ships parked side by side on the deep blue ocean. It looked exactly like an apocalyptic traffic jam on the water. It was a staggering, undeniable visual. The secret was officially out. The port was not undergoing a brilliant modern transformation. It was suffering a total systemic failure, and the entire city was watching it choke to death. Then came day 7. The total count reached 47 ships trapped at anchor. That was the catastrophic number that would headline every trade publication and business network for the next year. 47 massive vessels burning expensive fuel, racking up astronomical daily anchorage fees, incurring devastating demurrage charges, and triggering a cascading supply chain nightmare that reached across the globe. In the midst of that suffocating chaos, the international dispatchers and freight brokers completely abandoned the main switchboard at Morro Point. They knew the corporate operators reading off scripted apologies had no real power to save their cargo. They dug through their private contacts and started calling my personal phone number. They were terrified, bleeding thousands of dollars by the hour, and they needed someone to tell them the unvarnished truth. "Brooklyn, my vessel has been drifting out there for 4 days. A frantic broker from Rotterdam pleaded over the line, the sound of tearing paper echoing in the background of his office. "They keep telling me the system is optimizing. What is actually happening?" I did not gloat. I did not violate any non-disclosure agreements, and I did not actively sabotage my former employer. I simply sat at my new desk at Granite Shoals Marine, looked at my perfectly flowing, highly controlled digital yard map, and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "I cannot speak to the operational status of Morro Point," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly professional and sharp. "I no longer have any authority or access to their internal systems. However, if you are looking for a reliable contingency plan, Granite Shoals currently has 2 deep water berths available before sunset. Our rail interchange is completely clear, and we are actively opening receiving slots for emergency reroutes right now. I did not have to convince them or offer a sales pitch. The sheer relief in their voices was palpable. I was offering them a solid, concrete lifeline built on trust and competence. While my former bosses were handing them an unyielding algorithm, the shift was instantaneous. I hung up the phone, marked the new arrivals on the board, and let the old port drown in the exact future they had so aggressively demanded. The collapse of a maritime supply chain does not politely confine itself to the water. It crawls inland, infecting the wider economy like a slow, invisible, and utterly ruthless virus. The consequences of the paralyzed harbor quickly bled out into the region, striking businesses that had absolutely nothing to do with ocean freight. A massive regional supermarket chain, heavily reliant on a perfectly timed logistics model, suddenly found its produce sections completely bare. The brightly lit aisles were stripped of imported citrus, berries, and tropical fruits, leaving confused customers staring at empty plastic bins. Several counties away, a major industrial factory that assembled commercial air conditioning units had to completely halt its massive production lines. They were missing a highly specific electronic control module, a tiny component currently trapped inside a steel container sitting in the middle of the ocean. Most critically, a large private hospital group had to scramble frantically. They were forced to pay astronomical emergency premiums to violently reroute shipments of temperature-sensitive medicines and surgical supplies to Granite Shoals Marine, desperately trying to keep their operating rooms functional. Inside the administrative building of my former employer, the protective walls of corporate ignorance finally began to crack. Judith Sorrell, the chief financial officer of Morrow Point, had intentionally kept her hands clean of the operational politics. Judith was a woman who believed strictly in the purity of ledgers, profit margins, and quarterly forecasts. She had initially viewed the transition to the new software as just another expensive capital expenditure. But when the revised daily projected loss reports landed on her heavy oak desk, the neatness of her financial world vanished. She stared at the figures, watching them compound by the massive hour. Millions of dollars were rapidly evaporating in late delivery penalties, ruined cargo insurance claims, anchored vessel fees, and sheer, undeniable operational paralysis. Looking at the catastrophic red ink bleeding across her screen, Judith understood instantly that this was no longer a simple implementation glitch. It was a terminal financial hemorrhage, and it was going to drain the port completely dry. Blind panic in the executive boardroom inevitably led to the hiring of outside help. The board authorized the emergency deployment of 2 separate, incredibly expensive management consulting firms to diagnose the failure. These consultants arrived in the dispatch tower wearing tailored wool suits and carrying sleek tablets, ready to dissect the disaster with business school theories. It was a humiliating, farcical disaster. One of the senior analysts stood in the main observation deck, looked out at the churning, congested water, and genuinely asked the exhausted harbor master what a turning basin was. The other consultant, attempting to map out the yard congestion, firmly demanded to see the pallet flow diagram for the concrete staging area. He was completely oblivious to the fact that a pallet flow diagram is a concept that belongs strictly inside an indoor retail fulfillment center, not a heavy-lift breakbulk terminal where massive cranes hurl 40-ton steel boxes through the sky. Hearing those absurd questions, even the most neutral, compliant middle managers at Morrow Point felt a cold, heavy wave of absolute despair wash over them. The people sent to save them did not even speak the basic language of the water. It took a quiet, methodical internal auditor named Leah Dunn to find the actual rot hidden beneath the concrete. Leah was practically invisible within the corporate hierarchy, which made her incredibly dangerous to liars. Digging deep into the convoluted vendor agreements, she noticed a glaring discrepancy. The massive, multi-million-dollar contract for Stackfleet Pulse was not signed directly with the core software developer. Instead, the money was routed entirely through a tiny, obscure technology distributor called Turn Harbor Solutions. Leah cross-referenced the corporate filings and dug into the background of the shell company. The discovery was explosive. She found that the primary co-founder of Turn Harbor Solutions was Cade Whitmore's former roommate from graduate school. Furthermore, the contract contained a highly specific, incredibly lucrative performance clause. Turn Harbor Solutions was guaranteed to receive a massive implementation bonus, an extra 25% cut of the total contract value, if and only if Morrow Point entirely replaced its manual dispatch processes with the new application within exactly 90 days. I did not have to blow the whistle from my new office down the coast. I did not have to orchestrate a grand, vengeful sabotage or secretly contact investigative journalists. A sinking ship naturally creates its own rats. There were far too many people inside the Morrow Point administrative building who suddenly realized they were about to be permanently buried under federal indictments, gross negligence lawsuits, and ruined careers. To save their own skins, they started quietly, frantically backing up the internal servers. They saved encrypted emails, meeting minutes, and the exact technical warnings I had sent weeks prior. The truth began to flow out of the building through anonymous data drops and whispered phone calls. Simultaneously, the sheer scale of the logistical disaster triggered a massive federal response. The National Freight Stability Office, a powerful federal oversight agency, officially launched an emergency review of the entire terminal operation. The government regulators had been absolutely bombarded by frantic, furious complaints from massive retail chains, powerful maritime insurance conglomerates, and desperate shipping lines. Behind the heavy wooden doors of a closed executive session, Russ Whitmore desperately tried to shield his nephew from the impending slaughter. He pounded his fists on the mahogany table, arguing passionately for patience, demanding the board respect the difficult pains of a bold, tech-forward vision. But the room had turned ice cold. With every single word he spoke, Russ backed himself further into a corner. The other board members stopped looking at him as their esteemed chairman. They stared at him with undisguised contempt, seeing him Farcical as the corrupt sponsor of a catastrophic deal dripping with gross conflicts of interest. He was no longer a leader. He was a severe legal liability. Sitting at my desk at Granite Shoals Marine, reading a forwarded copy of Leah Dunn's explosive audit report, the final, bitter piece of the puzzle clicked perfectly into place. For weeks, a small, nagging part of my brain had wondered how I could have possibly been so blind to my own supposed operational failures. But looking at the paper trail of greed and kickbacks, I felt a strange, cold calm wash over me. I was not terminated because I was an inefficient, outdated relic. My 16 years of flawless, life-consuming operation were not a professional flaw. They were a massive, immovable obstacle. I was eliminated because my sheer competence and deep institutional knowledge completely ruined the digital transformation narrative that Cade desperately needed to sell. He needed to convince the board that the port was broken, so he could sell them the enormously expensive, personally profitable cure. My existence proved the port was actually functioning perfectly under human guidance. I was the single, inconvenient truth standing directly in the way of his corrupt, multi-million-dollar payout. He did not replace me with an application because the application was better. He replaced me because the application was going to make him incredibly rich, and my dedication to the actual work was going to ruin his perfect crime. When I took the reins at Granite Shoals Marine, I made a deliberate, ironclad promise to myself. I absolutely refused to build another lonely, precarious throne at the top of the dispatch tower. An operational structure that hinges entirely on the gut intuition and isolated memory of a single human being is not a strong system. It is a profound, catastrophic vulnerability just waiting for a stiff breeze to snap it in half. Instead, I built a round table. I forged a highly capable team of 6 dedicated operations managers. I did not want blind obedience. I demanded active, aggressive participation. I trained them to fiercely challenge my calls, to question my logic, and to comfortably alternate making the most critical, high-stakes decisions without constantly looking over their shoulders for my final approval. I spent the first 2 months aggressively extracting every single ounce of institutional knowledge buried deep within my own mind and pouring it directly onto paper. We covered the walls of the main conference room with massive, incredibly detailed process maps. We wrote out exhaustive, step-by-step survival scripts for sudden hurricane nights, leaving absolutely nothing to chance. We constructed a rigid, universally understood priority matrix for refrigerated cargo that completely removed the dangerous guesswork for the yard foreman. We established absolute, non-negotiable standards for calling the river pilots, and we codified the exact operational principles for handling sudden estimated time of arrival changes across 6 different global time zones. I was no longer hoarding my power or my knowledge. I was actively, intentionally distributing it, ensuring that the heartbeat of the port would never again rely on just one person. The ultimate vindication arrived quietly, slipping through the side doors rather than making a loud, boastful entrance. It started slowly with the people on the ground. 3 weeks into my new tenure, my direct office phone rang with a very familiar, deeply gravelly voice. It was the senior crane shift boss from Morrow Point, a tough, unyielding man who had famously complained for an entire decade that I was entirely too strict and demanding. He did not ask for a favor or offer polite small talk. He simply stated that he was entirely tired of taking dangerous orders from a glowing computer screen that did not understand what a 30-knot crosswind felt like 100 feet in the air. He asked if I had a locker open for him. Soon after that call, a master rail dispatcher silently defected, leaving his formal resignation on a Friday afternoon and walking confidently into my yard on a Monday morning. Then came a highly specialized refrigerated container technician, followed by a handful of the most seasoned, battle-hardened dock workers on the eastern seaboard. They did not abandon their old posts because they wanted a simple change of scenery. They left because they finally realized that my strict, relentless standards were the exact protocols keeping the heavy steel from crushing them to death. They willingly traded the chaotic, algorithmic nightmare of their deteriorating yard for the rigid, fiercely human-centric discipline of my new one. Even the workers who used to think I was a ruthless dictator realized they preferred a human dictator who actually knew how to keep them safe over a machine that viewed them as disposable data points. The massive, international shipping conglomerates naturally followed the talent, but their motivation was not rooted in some petty desire for revenge against Cade Whitmore. Spite is a terrible, unsustainable business model. They shifted their multi-million-dollar logistics contracts to Granite Shoals because, inside our dispatch center, they were treated as actual, breathing partners who were fighting the exact same volatile ocean. They were no longer treated as irritating, low-priority rows of data on a sleek, unfeeling corporate dashboard. When a massive storm delayed a vessel by 48 hours, they knew I would call them directly, explain the exact yard constraints, and offer a realistic, honest solution. When our quarterly revenue, overall container throughput, and systemic reliability metrics completely shattered every previous record the port had ever recorded, the executive board offered me a standing ovation. But I did not view those staggering numbers as a miraculous, unexpected gift. They were simply the inevitable, undeniable consequence of a profound truth. The woman they had explicitly discarded for being an obsolete relic was actually the only person who truly understood how a modern, high-stakes logistical hub was supposed to operate. Modernity is not about blindly erasing the human element. It is about giving the human element the absolute best tools and structural support to conquer the chaos. But the most magnificent, deeply satisfying victory of all did not happen out on the cold concrete docks or inside the sterile glass walls of the executive boardroom. It happened on a warm, beautifully clear Friday evening in the vibrant heart of the city. My younger sister, Marisol, was hosting the grand reopening of her family restaurant after a massive, year-long renovation project. For the very first time in 16 years, I did not arrive 3 hours late carrying a rushed, exhausted apology. I walked through the front doors of the bustling, brightly lit dining room exactly on time. I was not wearing my heavy, salt-stained work boots or my stiff, high-visibility safety jacket. I wore a dark, elegant silk dress that moved easily in the warm breeze. My waist was completely free of the bulky, heavy two-way marine radio that used to be physically anchored to my hip every waking hour. When I sat down at the large, crowded family table, completely surrounded by the incredible, rich smells of roasted garlic, fresh herbs, and simmering spices, I did not immediately place my cell phone next to my dinner plate. I left it entirely zipped inside my purse, completely out of sight. I ate a hot, delicious, uninterrupted meal without staring blankly at a digital title chart or frantically texting a rail coordinator. I actually listened to my sister laugh, completely present in the room, my mind entirely free from the crushing burden of anchoring ships and jammed logistical arteries. Elias sat directly across from me, his calm, observant eyes tracking my every movement with a look of quiet, profound wonder. He raised his glass of red wine, a soft, incredibly warm smile spreading across his handsome face. "It is incredibly good to finally meet you," Elias said quietly, his voice carrying years of patient relief. He was looking at a completely different version of the woman he loved. I was still sharp, fiercely commanding, and utterly ruthless when I stood inside the dispatch center, but the devastating, all-consuming martyr complex was finally gone. I no longer viewed infinite, agonizing sacrifice as the ultimate, necessary measure of my professional worth. Looking around that vibrant, noisy restaurant, watching my family celebrate without the dark cloud of my port-induced stress hanging over them, I realized a deeply painful but ultimately liberating truth. For over 10 years, Morrow Point Terminal remained operational purely because I devoted my utmost focus to its survival. I sustained that massive concrete behemoth by continually and voluntarily pouring my absolute maximum effort into its operations. But their arrogant betrayal had violently severed that toxic connection, forcing me to finally realize that I did not have to die a slow, miserable death just to prove I was exceptionally valuable. I was inherently worthy of a full, vibrant life outside the towering chain-link security fences. While my former employers were currently drowning under the crushing, suffocating weight of emergency board meetings, federal investigators, and ruthless corporate lawyers, I was sitting in a beautifully warm room, holding the steady hand of the man I loved, tasting an incredible meal. I was finally experiencing a massive, undeniable victory that cut far deeper and tasted infinitely sweeter than any corporate salary or executive title could ever provide. I had built a massive, flawless machine that ran perfectly on its own, and because I had finally built it right, I finally had my own life back. Cade Whitmore was a man rapidly running out of oxygen, and like any drowning corporate executive, his immediate instinct was to frantically pull someone else down into the freezing water with him. When the sheer scale of the logistical paralysis at his terminal became impossible to hide behind polished presentation slides, he predictably tried to rewrite the narrative. He hired an aggressive external crisis management firm and began circulating a vicious, desperate rumor throughout the regional maritime industry. Cade claimed he was the victim of malicious corporate sabotage. He loudly accused me of unlawfully poaching critical client relationships and stealing proprietary company knowledge, hoping to successfully mask his own staggering incompetence behind the illusion of a bitter, calculated betrayal. The legal team at Granite Shoals Marine did not simply issue a polite denial. They constructed an impenetrable titanium wall. Naomi Vance unleashed her senior corporate attorneys, who immediately sent a blisteringly sharp cease and desist letter directly to the executive board of Morrow Point. The legal document ruthlessly outlined the fundamental reality of the shipping industry. International freight dispatchers and sovereign shipping lines are not the exclusive, owned property of any single port authority. They go where the water is safe and the cranes actually move. Furthermore, my new attorneys attached hard, irrefutable copies of the 3 detailed warning emails I had sent to Cade weeks before my termination. Those time-stamped messages explicitly proved that I had practically begged to build a permanent internal knowledge retention database for them, an offer Cade had arrogantly ignored and dismissed in writing. His entire narrative of theft instantly disintegrated into legally actionable defamation. While Cade's external defense violently collapsed, his internal fortress was completely obliterated. Leah Dunn, the quiet internal auditor who had discovered the kickback scheme, formally submitted her findings to the official audit committee. She did not send a quiet digital file that could be easily intercepted or conveniently lost by the information technology department. She walked into the boardroom and dropped a massive, incredibly heavy physical binder directly onto the mahogany table. It contained everything. She provided the complete, unedited internal email chains, the rushed software deployment timeline, the damning commission addendum linked to Cade's former roommate, and the official meeting minutes where I was explicitly categorized as an obstacle to automation. The paper trail was absolute, undeniable, and completely fatal to Cade's career. But the final crushing blow did not come from a courtroom or a corporate boardroom. It came from the volatile, unforgiving atmosphere forming far out over the dark Atlantic Ocean. Just as the audit committee began reading Leah's explosive dossier, a massive offshore tropical depression violently shifted its trajectory. The storm system unexpectedly pivoted dead west, rapidly intensifying into a severe, highly destructive weather event heading straight for the Georgia coastline. The meteorological models painted a terrifying picture, instantly turning the congested ocean outside of Brackett Sound into a deadly trap. Out of the 47 trapped ships desperately waiting for clearance, 12 massive vessels were anchored in highly exposed, shallow holding zones. The harbor master issued a frantic blanket warning across all maritime frequencies. Those 12 ships had exactly 36 hours to find a secure, deep-water concrete berth, or the incoming hurricane-force winds would violently drag their heavy iron anchors across the ocean floor, inevitably snapping their chains and driving thousands of tons of steel directly into the jagged coastal breakwaters. Morro Point Terminal was already dead in the water, entirely paralyzed by its own software and completely incapable of absorbing a single new hull. The frantic ship captains had only one viable option left on the entire regional chart. They turned their desperate eyes toward Granite Shoals Marine. This was the absolute apex of the crisis, the ultimate, terrifying crucible I had been quietly preparing for. Taking in a few diverted ships over a week was a moderate operational challenge. But attempting to violently force 12 massive, unscheduled ocean liners into an already perfectly balanced, tightly scheduled terminal within a rapidly closing 36-hour window was a logistical nightmare that bordered on sheer insanity. If I blindly accepted them all without flawless calculation, the sudden, massive influx of steel and cargo would instantly gridlock my own rail lines, overwhelm my yard space, and completely destroy the pristine operational promises I had just made to my newly acquired clients. I was no longer just proving that I was significantly smarter than Cade Whitmore. I had to definitively prove that my human-driven system was robust enough to gracefully absorb the catastrophic, world-ending chaos created by his arrogant machine, all without dropping a single container or delaying a single existing contract. I did not hesitate. I immediately activated the emergency protocols I had drilled into my team. I summoned the entire night management crew into the main dispatch center. The room crackled with intense, focused electricity. I stood in front of the massive digital yard map and began a rapid, ruthless sequence of logistical surgery. We completely tore apart the standard crane flow schedule, resequencing the heavy machinery to operate at absolute maximum capacity. I instructed my rail coordinators to slice the inland train exchange windows into microscopic, highly aggressive fractions, maximizing every single inch of available track. I picked up my direct radio and negotiated the emergency borrowing of 4 additional heavy tugboats from a neighboring municipal pier to handle the sudden surge of river traffic. I placed a direct, forcefully persuasive phone call to the regional director of the Federal Agriculture Inspection Agency, successfully negotiating an expedited, rapid clearance protocol for the incoming quarantine loads. Finally, I carved out a strictly protected, high-priority green lane directly through the center of our concrete yard, ensuring that the critical medical supplies and high-value refrigerated cargo would never stop moving once they hit the asphalt. The storm winds began to howl outside the reinforced glass of my office window around midnight, rattling the heavy frames and carrying the sharp, bitter smell of ozone and churning seawater. The entire eastern seaboard was holding its collective breath, watching the satellite feeds as the massive steel ships began their desperate, synchronized sprint toward my open berths. The dispatch center was a symphony of ringing phones, low voices, and rapid keyboard clatter. Everything was moving fast, dangerous, and perfectly under control. At exactly 13 minutes past 2 in the morning, the heavy focused silence of my personal workspace was broken by the sharp vibration of my private cell phone resting on the edge of the desk. I glanced down at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed a name I honestly thought I would never have to see or acknowledge again. It was Cade Whitmore. I stared at the glowing letters for a long, heavy moment. The wind screamed against the glass, a chaotic, natural fury that perfectly matched the desperate ringing of the device. I reached out and answered the call, bringing the phone slowly to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply let the line remain open, allowing the silence to stretch out and suffocate the space between us. When Cade finally spoke, the slick, arrogant corporate projection was completely gone. The polished presentation voice, the condescending tone he had used to fire me, the unearned confidence of a man who believed software was a god, it had all been entirely stripped away. For the very first time since he had confidently walked into my life and tried to erase my existence, he sounded exactly like what he truly was. He sounded like a terrified, broken man standing alone on the bridge of a sinking ship, finally realizing that he had personally drilled the fatal holes in the hull with his own 2 hands. The glowing numbers on the digital clock resting on the corner of my desk read exactly 2:13 in the morning. Outside the reinforced glass of the dispatch tower, the tropical depression was unleashing its absolute fury against the coastline. The wind did not just blow, it screamed. A violent, high-pitched mechanical shriek that vibrated through the heavy steel beams of the building. Inside my office, however, the air was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of black coffee and ozone. I picked up my vibrating cell phone and pressed it against my ear, entirely surrounded by the calm, focused hum of my night management team executing our emergency survival playbook flawlessly. "Brooklyn," Cade Whitmore said. His voice was completely unrecognizable. The slick, polished, deeply arrogant corporate cadence he had wielded like a weapon on the morning he fired me was entirely gone. In its place was the raw, trembling frequency of a man watching his entire life burn to the ground. "You have to help me," Cade begged, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a frantic, suffocating rush. "We have completely lost control of the inbound sequence. The software is looping. It is generating phantom vessels on the digital map and issuing conflicting dock assignments to ships that are currently fighting 50-knot winds. The harbor pilots are refusing to take our calls. The entire holding pattern is collapsing inward. Please, Brooklyn, I just need 20 minutes of your time. Just 20 minutes of guidance to untangle the queue and save this night. I will authorize any consulting fee you want. Name your absolute price. I will wire the money right now." I did not respond immediately. I stayed completely silent, my breathing steady and perfectly measured. I turned my body and held the mouthpiece of my phone inches away from the cold glass of the window, allowing the microphone to pick up the terrifying, violent roar of the hurricane tearing across the ocean outside. I wanted him to hear exactly what kind of monster he was currently facing completely alone. After a long, agonizing moment, I brought the phone back to my mouth. "I cannot do that. Cade," I said, my voice as cold and flat as the concrete yard below me. "I am currently responsible for the safety and operational flow of an entirely different port facility. I am managing 12 diverted vessels right now. I do not have the right, nor do I have the desire, to betray the people who actually trusted me to guide them through this storm. If this terminal breaks tonight, I am a dead man," Cade pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "The board of directors, the federal investors, the regional media, the union bosses, they are all going to tear me to pieces the second the sun comes up. They are going to absolutely destroy me. You cannot just leave me here." That desperate, pathetic sentence was the exact moment the entire universe violently shifted on its axis. The supreme power he thought he held when he handed me that termination envelope had completely evaporated. He was nothing but a frightened child standing on a sinking ship, begging the woman he threw overboard to throw him a life preserver. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults or scream about the profound injustice of my firing. True power does not need to shout. I simply delivered one short, razor-sharp truth that cut deeper than any emotional outburst ever could.
You replaced a human being with an app, Cade, I said quietly.
So tonight, let the app answer the phone for you. I ended the call, placed the phone face down on my desk, and turned my attention back to the glowing blue screens of my thriving, heavily fortified terminal. When the sun finally rose hours later, casting a bruised, grayish light over the battered coastline, the brutal reckoning I had promised Cade arrived with federal authority. In the state capital, the National Freight Stability Office convened an emergency, heavily guarded investigative hearing. The massive chamber was packed with furious retail executives, sweating maritime lawyers, and aggressive investigative journalists. Leah Dunn, the quiet internal auditor, walked up to the central wooden table and calmly submitted her massive, devastating package of evidence. She handed over the printed internal emails, the forged deployment timelines, the secret commission addendums, and the damning meeting minutes. Following her, Judith Sorrell, the chief financial officer, took the microphone. Her voice did not waver as she read the exact, catastrophic financial damages into the permanent federal record, detailing millions upon millions of dollars completely vaporized by operational negligence. Finally, the lead federal investigator projected the raw system logs onto a massive screen, irrefutably proving that Stack Fleet Pulse had been forcibly, recklessly implemented into an environment it was never fundamentally designed to comprehend. The executions were swift and totally merciless. Russ Whitmore, his face pale and completely drained of his usual arrogant bluster, was forced to sign his immediate resignation from the board of directors before the morning recess even occurred. Cade Whitmore was summarily suspended, his security badges deactivated on the spot, and he was escorted out of the building by 2 armed federal marshals. The lucrative contract with Turn Harbor Solutions was instantly frozen, triggering a massive criminal investigation into severe conflicts of interest and blatant procurement fraud. Morrow Point Terminal was immediately placed under strict, humiliating federal oversight, and the software application that was supposed to revolutionize the industry was abruptly unplugged, permanently removed from the core dispatch grid. While that chaotic, blood-soaked hearing was taking place, my team and I were walking out of the dispatch center at Granite Shoals Marine. We had just completed a grueling, near-perfect night of operations. We had successfully absorbed all 12 massive vessels fleeing the storm. We had reorganized the rail windows, expedited the refrigerated cargo, and maintained the deep, unbreakable trust of every single client who had followed me. We survived the absolute worst nature could throw at us, entirely because we relied on the resilient, brilliant human network we had built together. Late that afternoon, my computer pinged with an urgent, highly confidential email from the newly formed interim board of directors at Morrow Point. It was a formal, desperately worded invitation. They practically begged me to return to my old office as the interim executive director. They promised me total operational control, a massive budget, and the authority to rebuild the terminal exactly as I saw fit. They wanted me to come back and save them. I stared at the glowing words on the screen, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt absolutely nothing for that place. I declined the offer. I did not refuse out of a petty, blind hatred or a lingering desire for vengeance. I refused because, standing in the aftermath of the storm, I finally understood a profound, deeply liberating truth. Saving a corporate entity that had actively, arrogantly chosen to erase me was no longer my moral obligation. I did not owe them my blood or my brilliance ever again. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my new dispatch room as the morning sky finally cleared, the heavy storm clouds fractured, allowing bright, golden sunlight to spill across the wet concrete of the yard. Behind me, The digital screens hummed with a steady, stabilizing blue light. The shipping channel was completely open. The massive gantry cranes were moving in a perfect, synchronized rhythm, and my marine radio sat perfectly quiet. The ultimate, beautiful sound of a highly dangerous environment under total human control. I looked out toward the distant northern horizon, miles away, parked in the deep water outside of Brackett Sound. The massive fleet of 47 stranded cargo ships still sat completely motionless at anchor. They looked like a giant, floating graveyard, a massive, undeniable monument to corporate arrogance. Staring at that catastrophic failure, I smiled. The executives had confidently called me a rigid, outdated relic of the past. But looking out at the chaotic, paralyzed ocean they created, there was only one undeniable truth left floating on the water. The woman they threw away was the only person who truly understood how to keep the entire world moving. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel. Hit that like button on the video, and show your support by clicking the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people around the world.